Are you struggling with customer experience challenges? OP360 has the solution. Say goodbye to long wait times and hello to seamless service. OP360's people-first approach is revolutionizing customer experience. By prioritizing employee satisfaction, OP360 delivers personalized experiences that drive business growth. Their agile solutions adapt quickly to your customers' needs, optimizing service while reducing costs. And here's an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Mention Agile when you contact OP360 and receive free agent training on qualified pilot programs, a $20,000 value at no cost to you. Don't miss out on this game-changing opportunity. Contact OP360 and learn how they can transform your CX strategy. OP360 is a better way to outsource. Visit op360.com. That's op360.com today.
The Agile brand.
Welcome to Season 6 of the Agile brand, where we discuss marketing technology and customer experience trends, insights, and ideas with enterprise and technology platform leaders. We focus on the people, processes, data, and platforms that make brands successful, scalable, customer-focused, and sustainable. This is what makes an Agile brand. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom, advising Fortune 1000 brands on martech, marketing operations, and CX, best-selling author and speaker. The Agile Brand Podcast is brought to you by TechSystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that my latest book, Priority is Action: 7 Principles for Better Strategies, Decisions, and Outcomes, is now available. In it, I give ideas and insights for leaders and teams that need to make meaningful progress on their priorities. After all, our priorities are what we do, not what we say we'd like to do. You can find Priority is Action on Amazon or learn more on my website, gregkihlstrom.com. Now let's get on to the show. The speed at which your customer data moves is critical to your success in shaping the customer experience, and the interoperability between your CDP and other critical martech systems can make the difference between a good and a great experience. Today, we're diving deep into the fast-evolving world of first-party data and customer data platforms with Justin DeBrabant, Chief Product Officer at ActionIQ. Justin, welcome to the show.
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this with you. Why don't we get started with you giving us an overview of your role as Chief Product Officer and what ActionIQ focuses on within the market?
I'm Chief Product Officer at ActionIQ. I've actually been at the company since the beginning, so it's been almost 10 years now as our first employee.
Nice.
So for better or for worse, I've seen all the ups and downs of 10 years at an early stage startup, and in the roller coaster that has been the CDP space. I oversee our product design, influence our engineering initiatives, and also a bit of our partnership strategy as it relates to kind of other ISVs in our ecosystem. And ActionIQ, we are, as you said, a customer data platform. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I'm sure if we asked a room of a couple of people from martech, if we asked 3 people, we'd get 5 different answers.
Right.
So I would say for us, we've always defined it broadly as really trying to allow large enterprises, and we are enterprise focused, really tap into their first party data and use that to power better customer experiences. So we're really about helping enterprises democratize data throughout the organization. A lot of data exists within different, IT infrastructure, systems, silos, applications, et cetera. But the teams that drive revenue, marketing, sales, service, support, et cetera, often don't have access to that. And so really the vision for us is democratizing that access, helping them make use of that data, and then ultimately use that data to drive better customer experiences.
Great. Well, yeah, let's dive in here. We're going to definitely touch on that and a few things here. Wanted to start with one of the things I brought up in the intro, which is that critical need for speed with customer data and the importance there. And so why is merely fast processing of customer data not sufficient? Why is real-time or maybe near real-time data handling critical for things like personalization and better customer engagement?
I mean, I think it's a balance. I would say that with all things data, it's best to start at the use case and the value of the data within that context of that use case, right? So think about it from a customer experience standpoint. If there's value in your own experience. Let's say you're checking into a hotel brand or you just scanned into a concert. Having kind of a real-time interaction with the brand. Hey, welcome. Here's some things you want to know. Here's what your status gets you. Hey, we gave you this free upgrade. Here's the lineup for the concert venue. All those things make a ton of sense in real time, and having access to that kind of full holistic customer profile and then being able to activate it in real time is truly critical, right? But not every customer experience is that. I mean, I hear a lot of times the example of a real-time experience being something like an abandoned cart or an abandoned browse real-time trigger, right? If you think about it truly in the context of real time, imagine if you added something to your cart, you went to a different tab and then immediately got a text message that said, hey, come back, you forgot this in your cart and here's 20% off. That's not a great experience, and the brand is giving away 20% for potentially nothing. Maybe they just got interrupted by an email.
Right.
So I think it's best to think about what's the right customer experience and then understand what are the data latency requirements that are necessary to drive that customer experience. And it's not always about, sub-second, millisecond, 200 millisecond processing. It's about understanding what's actually going to drive the right experience and then mapping the latency to that.
Yeah, and so given that, I mean, you gave a few examples there of when it makes sense as well as when it might not make sense. But do you think that that brands are kind of held back in being able to deliver a great customer experience because they're thinking real time isn't possible? In other words, like, how can real time data unlock things that maybe they're not thinking about yet?
Yeah, I think usually, so what happens is there's so many internal hops and processes for data that when marketers talk about the lack of real-time data, what they really mean is that by the time they get access to the data, it's 24 to 48 hours old, right?
Yeah.
And that's for most use cases, right? You've missed the mark at that point. You've missed that moment to drive a valuable customer experience. And why is that, right? Because the data needs to be collected, it needs to be governed, it needs to be routed to internal systems, it maybe needs to be cleansed. Maybe you need to do identity resolution. Maybe you need to kind of stitch it together with other data sources. Maybe there's some batch job that runs to dump the data into the warehouse, and then a view gets created, and then marketing is able to access it from there. And that whole process, historically, that's how data warehouses ran, right? It was like a 24-hour delay, a nightly batch process. And a lot of marketers are dealing with that reality. And then once the data is there within 48 hours, they can't even access it, right? Like they don't have the SQL skills to go and directly access it. So they file a ticket and their team pulls them a list. And at that point, more days have gone by. And the reality is when we talk to large enterprises, their latency is usually on the order of days to weeks by the time they're able to execute on kind of new campaign ideas with the data that's available, right? And that's completely insufficient, right? So I think that when marketers talk about real time, they don't always mean kind of millisecond latency. Really what they mean is more direct access to data as it's generated and the ability to do that themselves. Now, sometimes it does require, 200 milliseconds of latency because you're trying to drive, an in-person experience or a web experience. They clicked on this, make sure the next page that they view is personalized based on that. That makes a ton of sense and requires real-time data. But for, a lot of the rest of the marketing strategies, you don't need that level of latency, but you do need access to data that is fresh, that is up to date, and through interfaces and applications that give the non-technical, marketer or revenue teams the ability to ask questions directly, make use of that data, and then activate it.
Digital marketers, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less when you manage projects on Wix Studio. Work in sync with your team on one canvas, reuse templates, widgets, and sections across sites, create a client kit for seamless handovers, and leverage best-in-class SEO defaults across all your Wix sites. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio to see more. So that access issue, and I work with plenty of enterprise orgs and access, and the delay of days, if not weeks, it's real. I think a lot of people listening to this are probably living through that too. In addition to, the speed at which the data is processed, you touched on this as well, but the concept of interoperability, just access to the data, whether that's between systems or between systems and people and all the above. From your perspective, could you define, what do you mean by interoperability, and how do you look at that in the context of customer data platforms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe take a step back and think about where a CDP sits in the stack and be a little bit more specific than that.
Yeah.
At least kind of the original vision of the CDP was that the data exists within these infrastructure, these applications, but it was kind of all over the place, right? There wasn't a consistent customer 360. So the CDP would be the kind of unifying infrastructure layer across those different sources of data, maybe augmenting with its own tag or SDK data as well, right? And then sit in an agnostic way across the different downstream customer experience channels, right? So being able to push to email, mobile, paid media, owned and non-owned channels, customer support, CRM systems, whatever it was, that full CX stack. Obviously, CDPs are not those systems. They're not usually doing that last mile delivery, and they're not necessarily owning or the source of truth of the data. So they kind of sit, if you think about it, really at the center of a complex data stack underneath and a complex channel stack above them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there is a POV that the CDPs should really own the data, really pull it into their infrastructure, their data cloud, put it in their data model, and that they should also own the channels. And that's the kind of full stack approach like an Adobe or a Salesforce would take, right?
Yeah.
You have to be all in on that stack. You're not going to be able to support kind of channels outside of that ecosystem. It really exists inside that little bubble. The other approach is this best of breed stack, which is what we argue for, where regardless of the data source, whether we're the tag or not, whether it's we're managing the data or it's in your cloud data warehouse, we need to complement kind of the existing investments that are there. And then same thing on the channel side. We don't do that last mile delivery. We integrate with whatever ESP, whether it be the Adobe stack or Salesforce stack or independent, whether it be mobile push, integrates across the paid media ecosystem. And then there's nuances to that, right? Like, what about identity? Are CDPs the source of truth for identity, or are they stitching together kind of different identities, different assets, either from the first party data or also from third party data and augmenting with different forms of identity? And so usually, again, there's no hard and fast definition. And if you ask different vendors in the space, they'd probably disagree. But for me, it's really coming in. And I think also it's a reflection of the fact that we work in the enterprises. We're not going to be the all-in stack for everybody, right? So we need to come in and really complement the existing investments that the brand has made. On the data side, that means if they have a centralized cloud data warehouse, fantastic. We should be able to complement that. And that's this quote unquote kind of composable architecture where we sit on top of their cloud data warehouse. We federate queries down. We don't need to copy or move the data into our ecosystem. We're essentially leveraging exactly what they have. If they don't have that, right? If they haven't consolidated all the data or some data is not consolidated, then we should be able to manage that portion of the data. And really by interoperability across those different ecosystems, we can be kind of a stable interface to the business where they might be querying data across their cloud data warehouse or data that lives in ActionIQ, and they're building audiences in both or journeys in both, and they don't need to know or care where the data lives. Yeah. For us, that's really what data interoperability is. And then on the channel side, it's integrating with any and all downstream channels, right? We integrate with 300 plus channels. You pick your own stack, you pick your favorite ESP, mobile, paid media, et cetera, and we'll integrate down that across that stack. So for us, that's what interoperability means. It means really adapting what our deployment and our architecture is to where it adds the most value in the client's existing stack, as opposed to kind of starting a clean sheet of white paper and drawing things from scratch.
Yeah. So there's a few things you touched on there that I want to get back to, but starting, I want to get back to kind of the internal operational part of things, but I wanted to first talk a little bit about, you mentioned the stitching customer identities together, and I do think that's a big consideration for how customers are thinking about buying a CDP and implementing a CDP. So you mentioned there's a few different ways of thinking with that. what are the considerations that an enterprise should be keeping in mind when they're, I guess, when they're thinking about, what should be stitching those together? And, I think you touched on some of it, but, just to kind of double click on that a little bit.
Yeah. So I would say one is understand what the use cases are for the identity you're trying to create or define.
Yeah.
So, if it's a direct mail or email based use case, then you need to take, one approach to identity. If it's paid media and you're trying to do kind of anonymous retargeting or reactivation of users to your site who didn't authenticate, then it's a completely different form of identity because you're activating that across different channels. Now, I'm not saying they can't all be stitched together into one kind of consistent profile, but the reality is identity is not a singularity. You need to have different notions of identity that are going to be activated across different use cases and different channels. So one is, again, start with the understanding around that use case. And then from there, I think you need to work your way back and understand, okay, do I have the data that I need to support that notion of identity? And if not, do I need to augment that with different sources of identity or create kind of a more probabilistic view of identity based on the data that I do have? So as an example, if you're trying to do authenticated user email-based targeting and you're integrating data from multiple CRM systems that hasn't been integrated before, which is a very common use case, right? Then you need to probably do some form of probabilistic identity resolution. Take the, first name, last name, physical address, phone number, email address, assign some weight, do some clustering, create a golden profile, and define that authenticated identity from there. CDPs did not invent this, right? This has been part of MDM solutions for decades now. I think CDPs put a lot of fancy marketing material on Customer 360 and identity resolution, but the reality is nothing has really changed there in the last 15 years.
Right.
They've probably done it more specific to customer data and a use case than MDMs have historically, and there was a niche market for that. But it's really kind of standard probabilistic identity resolution. The kind of other angle is on the paid media side, right? So let's say you're getting anonymous data, you have devices, you have maids that you're collecting from your users on your site or maybe your mobile app. There, the goal is maximizing addressability and reach for the campaigns that you're going to run across different paid media systems. To do that, you might need to augment with third-party data, right? Be able to append, different device IDs into kind of a singular identity based on some third-party graph that you're integrating into your ecosystem, or augmenting kind of the ID that you have with different IDs that can be activated across the different paid media ecosystems. So you might need to think about augmenting what you have in your first-party data if your goal is activation across a digital ecosystem, where you're trying to maximize for reach and addressability. And the reality is you probably have to do both of these things, right? It's not either or. It's just understanding what the use cases are and then backing into the capabilities that you would need to support them.
Yeah. And I think all the more reason for the argument to have something that's a bit more flexible and able to adapt. And I mean, that kind of brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was, the interoperability. I mean, is it safe to say, is composability and interoperability, are there nuances to those definitions? Are we talking about the same thing here? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I think interoperability is probably a little bit broader, but they're the same flavor, same idea, right? When we talk about composable, what we mean primarily is around the storage and the compute. Like, where does the data live, right? And is the data in the cloud data warehouse, and we're essentially pushing queries down to one or more cloud data warehouses and never copying the data back? Or does it live within the CDP and there's a copy of the data and that customer 360 is defined within the CDP, which was the original architecture for a CDP, I think in part because nobody had mature cloud data warehouses, right? 10 years ago when the category started, there wasn't, hey, we have all our data in Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift. That just didn't exist. And now there's a critical mass of adoption of those systems where you go into a large enterprise and say, yeah, we've already defined our customer 360. It's all sitting here in this cloud data warehouse. why would I want to copy it into your infrastructure? And I think that's a good question to ask, right?
Yeah.
So for us, composability, and I think generally speaking in the CDP space, composability is really around kind of the data and the storage, and is starting to become about the identity as well, and being able to plug in different identity spines or third-party data into that kind of customer 360, versus kind of having something out of the box yourself. And interoperability, I would say, is a much broader kind of architectural principle about working seamlessly across the stack. And I think interoperability applies into how we integrate with the channel ecosystem downstream, right? Like we're interoperable across an Adobe, a Salesforce, and an Oracle stack. And for a lot of our clients, we actually are integrating with, some channels from each of them, and we're interoperable across them.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about what's coming down, some future trends and stuff. But, first I wanted to mention, it's interesting, Gartner just released its first quadrant on CDPs. As you mentioned, CDPs have been around for a bit, a little over a decade here. So nothing like taking the time to get it right, right? But it took them a while, and probably for some of the reasons you mentioned earlier, which is that the definition can be a little nebulous depending on who you ask. But I do have to say, by the way, congrats on your placement as a visionary on that quadrant. So that's a huge achievement.
Yeah, we're very excited about that.
Yeah, and it's great to be able to see how the different players are stacking up, so to speak, in that framework. From your perspective, and having been doing this for a little over a decade here, is the CDP market too fragmented to have a quadrant? Is that one of the reasons why it took so long? Or do you see, is further consolidation coming down the pike, or either even further fragmentation?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of a chicken or the egg situation here.
Yeah.
Like, is the category defined, then Gartner and Forrester come, like defined in practice, then Gartner and Forrester come and kind of put their rubber stamp on it? Or should they be the ones really helping define the category and shaping it? And, I think that for a long time, the lack of, magic quadrants or waves or kind of real strong opinions on the CDP space from those vendors, from those analysts, I think did the space a disservice.
Yeah.
I think there were a couple of reasons for that. I could take a more pessimistic view to this, but I'll take kind of I'll take a more practical view where I think this was a tricky space because it was between data and infrastructure and kind of IT systems and the marketing stack, right? And traditionally, the big analysts have had kind of focus in one or the other, but it's tricky to have kind of a POV across both of those, right?
Yeah.
And so it kind of created this kind of who owns this situation. And even in the market, right? Like our buyers who are CMOs for the first 5 or 6 years exclusively, and increasingly most of our new logos, our new pipeline is being driven by CIOs, in collaboration with CMOs, but CIOs are increasingly the buyer. So we've seen a shift in the market. And I think that kind of confusion probably prolonged the uncertainty with the analysts. The other thing I'd say is this has been a hot space for a while, and there were some unique, shall we say, macro conditions that I think prolonged some of that confusion. I mean, you had things were really starting to heat up going into 2019 and 2020, and then you had the pandemic. What did that do? It created a surge in investments in digital, right? Like a lot of has been written about how that probably accelerated the shift to digital for these brick and mortar brands, especially by at least a decade.
Yeah.
So you saw a ton of money rushing into this space, which was great. But then because of that, you saw a lot of companies that were in, dead or shrinking categories kind of pivoting over to the CDP space and trying to claim a portion of that. Most of these companies are VC backed. There was a ton of loose money in 2021. People were fundraising at ridiculous revenue multiples that were never sustainable. These were never going to be real businesses, but They raised a ton of money. What did they do with that money? They pumped a bunch of money into go to market, paid for marketing, paid for sales teams. That created confusion, even around products that were never going to last. or that we're only solving a kind of a small niche problem within the space. And now I think you're seeing the reconciliation of all that, right? The money is much tighter. You really need to be there. There's also a lot of efforts within brands to kind of consolidate costs, consolidate and reconcile their tech stack. So if you were a point solution CDP, you're often now getting replaced by a much broader solution, which we're doing more and more of. And so you're starting to see kind of that the market, I think, consolidate after that expansion period. And now, it's great. Gartner and Forrester are on board saying this is the market. I wish it had happened a little bit sooner.
Yeah.
But I do think that we're at the point now where things are going to become a lot less fragmented. I think a number of companies that are even in the quadrant now are companies that won't last another year or two.
Yeah.
And you're going to see, in 2-3 years, a much cleaner picture of the space.
Yeah, got it. And so, there's many reasons to adopt a CDP, but one of the big reasons that kind of prompts the conversation is just this need for the first party data strategy, deprecation of third party cookies. Eventually, it's actually going to have. We've been talking about it for it feels like a decade, but we've been talking about it for at least a few years now, and it will eventually happen. But what other changes do you see that are impacting whether it's investment decisions in a CDP in the enterprise, or just that are affecting some of the challenges that CDPs can help solve?
Yeah, and what's crazy about the third party cookie thing is that in the early years of the CDP space, CDPs didn't really do any of that. I mean, you would, if you had authenticated data and hashed emails, you could activate to the paid media channels, but you always kind of had a DMP on one side for the acquisition,
Right.
use cases fueled entirely by cheap cookies and third party data. And then you had the CDP for the kind of retention focused use cases. And we used to describe these kind of as two pillars of that customer experience stack. And then, the rug got ripped out of the
Right.
DMP side. All those products are dead. I don't think people have realized how quick of a shift that was from how critical those were. They're all dead or deprecated. And now
Yeah.
CDPs have really transitioned to owning that full customer lifecycle in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think we were, one of the early kind of people realizing that CDP should do more than just the retention side of things.
Yeah.
So it's funny because that really wasn't even on the radar 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, it was discussed, but it didn't seem practical. And now it's just become a given that CDPs inherit all the use cases from DMPs.
Yeah.
And it makes sense though, right? DMPs were about third-party data. CDPs are about first-party data. What's really happening with the death of the cookie is brands need to focus on first-party data. That's what they have, right? Third-party data is not as plentiful. It's not as cheap. You can augment it in very specific places, but without cookies, it's a massive reduction, right? And so you need to focus on your first-party data strategy, and CDPs are that. So it makes a ton of sense. It happened very quickly. And back to the question, what are maybe some of the other trends that we're seeing? The investments in the cloud data warehouses is a big one, right? I think that this whole composable architecture creates the opportunity to start to deploy CDPs in a much more nimble and agile way. You can very quickly set up a CDP on top of your cloud data warehouse, connect to a few tables, and provide the business with an interface. We're doing these deployments within a day, honestly.
Yeah.
And so, being able to test and iterate and POC these new technologies that quickly, get the marketing teams excited, get the creative juices flowing, generate new use cases, you get that flywheel turning a lot easier than, a 3-month deployment that costs hundreds of thousands in kind of data, ETL work, stitching together all these different assets, et cetera. So I think it's creating opportunities to accelerate that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Justin, thanks so much for joining today. One last question before we wrap up. You've given a lot of great advice and insights already, but if there's one thing, kind of touching on the last point you were making, if there's one thing that our listeners could do to kind of try to navigate this limbo state pre third party cookie deprecation, what should they be thinking about doing today?
And they just need to embrace the first party data strategy. Everybody's a data company, whether they want to realize it or not. Products and services are good but not sufficient to really differentiate in the modern world, right? You need data. Data is going to be your asset, and you need to build up not only the systems and processes, but also the organizational muscle around making use of that data. And a CDP is, a technology enabler to that, but it's not the only thing that needs to happen. So again, I've sat in conversations where people just throw up their hands and they say, well, we don't have good first party data, so we can't do that. And it's like, well, you need to start with what you have, but you also need to invest in strategies to collecting better first party data and investing in that data strategy, because I truly believe that brands that aren't now are going to be quickly left behind.
Yeah, love it. Well, again, I'd like to thank Justin DeBrabant, Chief Product Officer at ActionIQ, for joining us today. And you can learn more about Justin and ActionIQ by following the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening to The Agile Brand, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.gregkillstrom.com. That's GregKihlstrom.com. While you're there, check out my series of best-selling Agile Brand guides, covering a wide variety of marketing technology topics, or you can search for Greg Kihlstrom on Amazon. The Agile Brand is produced by Missing Link, a Latina-owned, strategy-driven, creatively fueled production co-op. From ideation to creation, they craft human connections through intelligent, engaging, and informative content. Until next time, stay agile.
The Agile Brand.
Hi, I'm Mark Slayton, the host of the Delighted Customers podcast and the creator of the Trusted Guide Roadmap. The number one challenge of any change leader is getting executive buy-in. Without it, CX practices are destined to fail. You know the frustration when you don't have the support that you need. That's why I developed the Trusted Guide Roadmap Masterclass. It's unique because it's live, interpersonal, hands-on, and we give you proven frameworks, tools, calculators, and other resources to empower you to effectively lead change. To learn more, visit empoweredcx.com. Enrollment is now open for this quarter's masterclass starting October 16th. Don't miss your chance to join us.